A millionaire always helped a homeless girl outside his mansion. When he caught her sneaking in with a ladder, he decided to wait for her to come out and confront her about the theft. But when he saw smoke pouring from his house, his heart raced. 2 minutes later, the girl opened the mansion door, and what she held in her arms brought him to tears. The wrought iron gate, tall and imposing, was a border between two worlds. On one side, Arthur's mansion rose like a modern palace, with meticulously manicured gardens and windows that reflected the blue sky like mirrors to a private paradise. On the other, the hot asphalt of the street, where a small, solitary figure sat on the curb, hugging her knees. Every day for months, the scene repeated itself. Leah, 7 years old, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of a lifetime, waited. She never begged, never shouted, never rattled the gate. She just waited, with a dignity that disarmed and deeply intrigued Arthur. From his living room, through immense glass walls, he watched her. In his lap, little Leo, his 2-year-old son, babbled happily, completely oblivious to the conflict raging in his father's chest. Arthur felt a familiar pang of mistrust, a slow-acting poison that had seeped into his soul since the divorce. Veronica, his ex-wife, had used his kindness as a weapon, twisting his compassion into weakness and his trust into a minefield of betrayals. Her voice still echoed in his mind at moments like this. "You're so predictable, Arthur, always wanting to save the world, but you can't see the evil right under your nose." Those words haunted him, turning every act of generosity into a high-stakes gamble. And yet, looking at the small girl huddled on the other side of the gate, he couldn't just ignore her. There was something in her stillness, in the way her fragile shoulders slumped, that breached the walls he'd built around his heart. It was an impulse stronger than his paranoia, a genuine desire to alleviate, even for a moment, the weight that child carried. He squeezed Leo's tiny hand, feeling the softness of his son's skin. It was for him, for this small being, that he feared so much. The world was a dangerous place, and he would do anything to protect him. Sighing, Arthur stood and went to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator and made a thick sandwich, grabbed an apple and a small bottle of juice. He put everything in a brown paper bag, along with a few dollars he took from a jar on the counter. It was his daily ritual, a ritual his new girlfriend, Isabella, subtly disapproved of. "Don't you think you're encouraging it, honey?" she had said the night before, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Those kids are often used by adults. You don't know where that money really goes." Perhaps she was right, but Leah's eyes didn't lie. In them, he saw hunger, not malice. Stepping out the front door, the morning air enveloped him. The nanny, Claire, a middle-aged woman with a serene face that inspired confidence, waved at him from the doorway. "Have a good day, Mr. Arthur. I'll take good care of our little angel." He smiled, grateful. With Claire, at least, he felt he could let his guard down. He walked down the stone path to the gate. Leah stood as soon as she saw him, her eyes fixed on the bag in his hand. He opened the small side gate and held out the food. "Good morning, Leah." "Morning, sir," she answered, her voice low, almost a whisper. Her small, smudged fingers brushed against his for a second as she took the bag. She didn't open it right away. She just clutched it to her chest like a treasure. "Take care," he said, and the gate clicked shut between them. As he drove away in his luxury car, Arthur glanced in the rearview mirror. The girl was still there, standing, but she wasn't eating. She was watching the house, her brow furrowed in an expression of intense concentration. He didn't know it, but at that exact moment, Leah saw something he couldn't see. The back door to the kitchen opened discreetly, and Claire, the nanny he trusted so much, handed a small envelope to a man waiting in the garden's shadows, a man whose face she had never seen before. The gesture was quick, secret, and charged with a tension that sent a shiver down the girl's spine. Something was not right. The shiver that ran through Leah wasn't from the cold. The morning sun was already warming the pavement. But the image of that envelope changing hands in the gloom of the garden seemed to have frozen something inside her. It wasn't right. Street kids learn to read people and situations with a speed that a life in a safe house could never teach. They learn to distinguish a look of pity from a look of contempt, genuine kindness from calculated falsehood. And what she had seen was a secret, a quick, silent, heavy secret, exchanged between the kind-faced nanny and a stranger who vanished as quickly as he appeared. For a moment, Leah thought about running, about getting away from this house that suddenly seemed to have shadows where there had only been light. But then, the image of little Leo came to mind, the curly-haired boy who sometimes appeared at the upstairs window, waving his chubby little hand. He was too small and defenseless. A knot of worry formed in her throat, stronger than fear. She wasn't going anywhere. She would stay here on the other side of the gate and watch. Meanwhile, miles away, at the top of a glass and steel skyscraper, Arthur tried to focus on a spreadsheet of financial projections. The numbers danced before him, but his mind was at home. It was on Leo's laugh, on the smell of baby powder that still clung to his clothes, on the peace he felt knowing his son was safe in Claire's care. He leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand over his face. The divorce had left him in pieces, but Leo was the glue holding him together. Protecting that child was the only purpose that truly mattered. His phone buzzed on the desk, displaying Isabella's picture. He answered with a tired smile. "Hey, love, am I interrupting?" Her voice was as smooth as velvet. "Never. Is everything okay?" "No, honey. Just calling to see how you are." "Busy day." "The usual," he replied, grateful for the distraction. "But I'll be free soon." "Good. I was thinking, has your lawyer gotten back to you about restructuring the assets? I just worry about our future, you know. It's important to have everything organized, especially because of Leo." A shadow of his old suspicion crossed his face, as quick as lightning. Veronica used to be interested in his assets, too, always under the guise of organizing the future. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. Isabella wasn't Veronica. She was different, attentive, concerned. "Not yet, but I'll follow up," he said, forcing a light tone. "Don't worry about it." Late in the afternoon, Leah was still there, hidden behind a large bush that gave her a prime view of the mansion's side entrance. She saw Isabella's car approach, a sports model that glided silently down the street. Isabella got out, impatient, already on the phone. Her voice, now, was anything but velvety. It was hard and sharp. "I already told you we can't wait any longer," she hissed into the phone. "We have to accelerate the plans. Every day that passes is a risk. No, he can't suspect a thing. Just do what we agreed on and be discreet." She ended the call abruptly, her face a mask of frustration. She took a deep breath, recomposed her expression, and with a radiant smile on her face, rang the doorbell. The door was opened by Claire. As the two women went inside, Leah noticed something that made her small heart leap. Near the gate Isabella had entered, there was a small grey box with a slowly blinking red light, a security camera. Leah watched it every day, but at that moment, as the door closed, the little red light blinked one last time and went out. The small lens went completely dark. Someone, from inside the house, had turned off the eyes watching the gate. When Arthur's car slid silently through the automatic gates at the end of the day, the first thing he saw was a scene that should have warmed his heart. On the verdant lawn, under the shade of an old oak tree, Isabella was sitting on a picnic blanket with Leo. She held a colorful toy in the air, and the boys' laughter echoed through the garden, a pure, crystalline sound that was Arthur's favorite music. Claire stood nearby, watching them with a maternal smile. It looked like a perfect family portrait, an image of peace and happiness he longed for. For a moment, he let himself believe it. Maybe Isabella was right. Maybe he worried too much, seeing ghosts of a painful past in every shadow. He got out of the car, the exhaustion of the workday melting away at the sight of his happy son. "Daddy's home," Isabella sang, breaking into a wide, luminous smile. Leo turned, his eyes shining, and stretched his little arms toward Arthur, babbling an excited "Dada." Arthur scooped his son into his arms, inhaling the sweet scent of his skin. "Hey, champ, did you have fun today?" He kissed the top of Leo's head and smiled at Isabella. "Thanks for coming early." "Of course, honey. I love spending time with him," she said, getting up and smoothing her impeccable dress. "Claire and I were just enjoying the sun. It's been such a quiet day, but the tranquility was a facade." Arthur, with his mind trained to analyze systems and find flaws, had a nightly ritual. After putting Leo to bed, he always checked the security system logs. It was a habit born of paranoia, but it gave him a sense of control. That night, sitting in his office, the house silent around him, he navigated through the day's recordings, and then he saw it. A gap. A period of exactly 35 minutes in the afternoon, when the camera covering the side entrance and part of the garden was completely offline. A cold message on the screen read, "Signal lost." A chill ran down his spine. This was not a common glitch. The system had backup generators and multiple redundancies. A signal loss like that indicated a manual disconnect or a very specific failure. He called Claire into the office. The nanny entered, her face a mask of solicitous concern. "Claire, did you notice anything strange with the cameras this afternoon?" "This one," he pointed to the monitor, "was offline for over half an hour." Her eyes widened in a convincing performance of surprise and fear. "My goodness, sir, no, I didn't see a thing. We were in the front garden with little Leo. How dangerous. Do you think it was a technical problem?" Isabella, who had overheard the conversation, came into the office, placing a reassuring hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Honey, don't be alarmed. These things happen. It must have just been a system failure. You stress way too much about all this security. We're safe here." Her words were like a balm, but Arthur's gut screamed that something was wrong. He wanted to believe them, to accept the simple explanation. But Veronica's voice echoed again. "You always choose the easy way out, don't you? The truth that comforts you." He forced a smile. Pretending to agree, "You're both right. It must be that." But when he was alone again, he didn't shut down the computer. Instead, he accessed the logs from another camera, one with a wider angle that caught a distant part of the same garden. He fast-forwarded the video to the exact moment the other camera had lost its signal. The image was grainy, distant, but unmistakable. In the corner of the screen, almost hidden by foliage, Claire's figure appeared for a second. She wasn't looking at Leo or Isabella. She was looking directly at the camera that, moments later, would go dark. And on her face was an expression that was not of serenity or care. It was an expression of cold, calculated confirmation. The air in Arthur's office grew thin, icy. The frozen image of Claire on the monitor was a silent, undeniable betrayal. Every gentle smile, every comforting word she had given him over the past months crumbled to dust, revealing something ugly and unknown beneath. He felt the floor drop out from under him. The woman he trusted with his son's life, the most precious thing he had, was lying to him. And Isabella's calm dismissal of his concerns now sounded less like reassurance and more like complicity. Were they in this together? The thought was a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. The poison of mistrust, which he fought so hard to contain, now coursed freely through his veins. His mind flashed back 3 years, a cold night, much like this one, when he confronted Veronica about unexplained withdrawals from their joint accounts. She had cried, accusing him of being controlling, of suffocating her with his suspicion. She said the money was to help her sick mother, a lie woven with tears and sobs, so convincing he had almost apologized. He had held her, feeling like a monster for doubting her. Weeks later, he discovered the money had financed a lover's apartment. The humiliation of that memory burned inside him. He would not make the same mistake. There would be no rash confrontation, no passionate accusations. This time he would be the hunter, not the prey. He stood silently and went upstairs, his bare feet barely touching the soft carpet. He opened the door to Leo's room with infinite care. The faint light from a moon-shaped nightlight bathed the crib, where his son slept, his breathing soft and even. One tiny hand was open on the blanket, fingers curled like the petals of a flower. A fierce, overwhelming love washed over Arthur, a wave of protectiveness that drowned every other feeling. He would stand there all night if he had to ensure no harm came to that little angel. This room was his sanctuary, and he felt as though snakes had slithered inside. Outside, the night swallowed the street. Leah, huddled in her hiding spot, felt hunger twisting her stomach. The sandwich Mr. Arthur had given her was a distant memory. She should leave, find a safe place to sleep, but her feet felt glued to the pavement. She watched the mansion's windows, the lights going out one by one, until only a small sliver of light remained upstairs. A bad feeling, a tightness in her chest, kept her from leaving. It was the same feeling she got when she saw a fight about to break out on the street, or when she sensed a storm was brewing, even if the sun was still shining. Tomorrow, she would be back, earlier, before anyone else. Back in his office, Arthur made his decision. He couldn't trust technology that could be sabotaged. He couldn't trust the people who worked for him. He could only trust his own eyes. He picked up his phone and opened his calendar. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. A crucial board meeting. He typed a short email to his assistant. Subject, urgent cancellation. I'm very sorry, but I'm not feeling well. Please cancel all my appointments for tomorrow afternoon. We will reschedule shortly. He hit send without hesitation. The plan formed in his mind, clear and cold as ice. He would leave for work at the usual time. He would let the house's routine unfold like any other day. But in the early afternoon, when everyone's guard was down, he would return. Not through the front gate, but through a service entrance at the back that no one used. He would enter his own home like a thief, silent and unseen, and he would find out the truth. The next morning dawned with an almost insulting normality. The sun poured through the mansion's windows, painting strips of golden light on the marble floors, while the smell of fresh coffee wafted up from the kitchen. To any observer, it was the start of another perfect day in Arthur's life, but beneath the surface, he was a man at war with himself. Every smile he gave Claire, every word exchanged with Isabella, who had stayed the night, was an act of dissimulation that cost him immense energy. He put on his expensive suit like a suit of armor, planted a kiss on Leo's forehead that was a silent promise of protection, and prepared for the performance of his life. Mistrust was a ravenous animal in his chest, and he needed to keep it caged for just a few more hours. Outside, Leah had arrived before the first rays of sun touched the treetops. The pre-dawn chill still clung to her bones, and her stomach rumbled with a familiar emptiness. But she ignored the discomfort. Something pulled her to this place, a loyalty she didn't understand herself, an instinct that her presence here mattered. She settled into her observation post, her eyes fixed on the house, waiting. When Arthur left, the routine repeated, but with an undercurrent of tension that only he felt. "Have a good day, honey," Isabella said, giving him a quick kiss. "Don't work too hard." "We'll take care of everything here, Mr. Arthur," Claire added, picking up Leo's small backpack. He just nodded, a knot of ice in his stomach. Claire's smile looked like a porcelain doll's, beautiful and empty. He got in the car and drove off, watching them in the rearview mirror until the house disappeared from view. But he didn't go to the office. He drove a few blocks away and parked on a side street, where he had a clear view of his property's entrance without being noticed. Time dragged on. Every minute was torture. He watched cars pass, people walking their dogs, life going on as normal while his own seemed on the verge of imploding. Leah, from her hiding spot, saw Isabella's car leave around noon. She saw a delivery driver drop off a package. She saw Claire take Leo for a short walk in his stroller, always close to the gate. Everything seemed normal. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the bad feeling was just hunger. She was about to give up, ready to look for food elsewhere, when she saw something that made her hold her breath. An old painter's truck, battered and covered in paint splatters, pulled up across the street. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there, the engine running, as if waiting for a signal. Then, from the truck bed, he took out an old wooden ladder and leaned it discreetly against the side of the mansion's wall, in a blind spot from the main street. At that exact moment, 2 blocks away, Arthur started his car. It was time. His heart hammered against his ribs. He drove slowly, using the back service entrance as planned. The key turned in the lock with a muffled click. He stepped into his own home, feeling like an intruder. The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. He crept up the stairs, his feet making no sound on the carpet. The door to Leo's room was ajar. He should be napping. Arthur went to his office, which had a window overlooking the same side garden where the camera had been turned off the day before. He hid behind the heavy curtain, his heart in his throat, waiting to catch Claire in the act. And then he saw it. His mind refused to process the scene for a second. It wasn't Claire. It wasn't a stranger. Climbing the painter's ladder with surprising agility, heading toward the open window of his son's bedroom, was the small, fragile figure of Leah. The betrayal was a physical blow, as real and painful as a knife wound. Arthur staggered back, leaning against the cold wall of his office, the air escaping his lungs in a sharp hiss. The image of the girl, this child to whom he had offered kindness and food, breaking into his home, climbing toward his son's room, was a grotesque distortion of reality. All his worst suspicions, all his darkest fears, seemed to materialize in that instant. Veronica was right. Isabella was right. He was a fool, a sentimental fool who had been duped by a pair of sad eyes and a stage dignity. The compassion he had felt for her curdled into an icy fury. She wasn't an innocent victim. She was bait, a tool, part of a much larger, more sordid plan. Rage bubbled inside him, hot and bitter. His first instinct was to run out there, to rip the girl off that ladder and scream until she confessed who had sent her. But the memory of Veronica's trap stopped him. Impulsiveness was his Achilles heel. No, he wouldn't act on impulse. He would catch her red-handed, with the evidence in his hands. He would let her get inside, let her reveal her true purpose. He hid behind his own car, parked in the side garage, his heart beating a frantic, uncontrolled rhythm against his ribs. The cool metal of the vehicle was his only anchor in a world that was spinning dizzily. He watched, muscles tensed, every movement the girl made, waiting for the right moment to confront her, to unmask her and everyone behind this cruel charade. Leah, oblivious to the storm of emotions in the man watching her, reached the windowsill. Her small body was trembling, not from fear but from urgency. Minutes earlier, from her observation post, she had seen Claire hurry out the back door, her face pale and frightened after a tense phone call. The nanny had looked from side to side like a cornered animal before disappearing through a gate at the back of the garden. And almost immediately, a strange smell began to float on the air, a sharp, chemical smell that Leah knew well from the streets, the smell of an accelerant. And then a thin column of dark smoke began to rise lazily from a downstairs window. No one screamed, no alarm sounded. The house was silent, deathly silent. But Leah knew that inside, on the second floor, little Leo was taking his afternoon nap, alone and vulnerable. There was no time to think, to find help. She yelled, she banged on the gate, but no one answered. The street was deserted. The driver of the painter's truck had already left, leaving the ladder behind like a chess piece in its place. It was her only chance. Her heart pounded as she climbed, the wooden rungs creaking under her feet. Fear was a cold claw in her stomach, but the image of Leo's smiling face was stronger. She jumped from the ladder to the ledge and squeezed through the open bedroom window. The smell of smoke was stronger inside. It was coming from downstairs, creeping up the staircase. She ran to the crib. Leo was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. She scooped him into her arms, the unexpected weight of the boy making her stumble for a moment. He grumbled but didn't wake. Hugging him tightly, she turned to leave through the door, and that's when she saw it. The bedroom door was closed, and from under the crack, thick, black smoke was already beginning to seep in, coiling like a venomous snake. Arthur's world disintegrated in a fraction of a second. The acrid smell of burning hit his nostrils at the same time. The first puff of black smoke escaped from one of the downstairs windows. The anger, the suspicion, the betrayal, it was all incinerated by an overwhelming wave of pure panic. Leo, his son, was in there. The image of the crib, the smell of baby powder, the small, vulnerable body sleeping, exploded in his mind with the force of a bomb. The girl, the ladder, the plan, none of it mattered anymore. Only the fire, the smoke, and Leo. A primal scream, a guttural sound of raw terror, tore from his throat. He burst from his hiding place, his body moving on pure instinct, sprinting toward the house that was beginning to be devoured by an unseen enemy. He had no key, no plan, just the blind, desperate need to get to his son. But before he could take more than a few steps, the front door burst open with a violent bang, and from the cloud of smoke that poured out, a small figure emerged, stumbling, coughing, nearly falling. It was Leah, and in her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was Leo. The boy was crying, his face smudged with soot, but he was alive, he was breathing, he was safe. Leah scrambled across the lawn, away from the danger, her small lungs fighting for air. Seconds later, a downstairs window shattered, and orange flames licked hungrily at the mansion's facade, confirming the terrible reality of the fire. Arthur stopped, petrified. The scene before him was so surreal, so contrary to everything he had just assumed, that his brain simply couldn't process it. The girl he had been ready to accuse, to hand over to the police as a thief, was standing there, gasping and covered in soot, holding his son's life in her fragile arms. The relief was so intense, so overwhelming, that his knees gave out. He collapsed onto the lawn, the sound of his own sob taking him by surprise. Hot, uncontrollable tears began to stream down his face, washing away the anger, the fear, and the suspicion, leaving behind only a raw, absolute gratitude. She hadn't come to steal, she had come to save. Leah, still shaking, cautiously approached him, clutching Leo to her chest. The boy, seeing his father, reached out his little arms, his cries turning into a desperate call. "Dada!" Arthur crawled to them, taking his son into his arms and holding him with a force that mixed terror and relief. He kissed Leo's dirty face, his hair, his hands, murmuring his name over and over like a mantra. Then he looked up at Leah. The girl's eyes, wide and frightened, were filled with tears. I saw her," Leah stammered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. She pointed toward the back of the house with a trembling hand. "The nanny!" She threw some liquid with a bad smell, and she lit the fire. She locked Leo's bedroom door and ran away. I yelled, but nobody heard. Each word was a piece of a horrifying puzzle snapping into place in Arthur's mind. Claire, the woman with the serene face, the trustworthy nanny, the camera being turned off, the silent escape. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. An attempt to... He could barely form the thought. He looked at the flames now dancing hungrily on the second floor, right where his son's room was. If Leah hadn't been there, if she hadn't had the courage to climb that window, Leo... The understanding hit him with the force of a tidal wave, leaving him breathless. Someone had tried to take the only thing in the world that mattered from him, and the only person who had stood in the way was the child he had despised. The sharp wail of sirens tore through the quiet air of the wealthy neighborhood, a lament announcing the violation of that artificial peace. Within minutes, the street was filled with red fire trucks, police cars, and curious neighbors. Their faces a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Arthur sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped over his shoulders, though he felt no cold. Leo was on his lap, calm now, clinging to his shirt with surprising strength, as if afraid he would be torn away. Leo sat beside him, small and hunched, while a paramedic cleaned a scrape on her arm. She said nothing, just watched the commotion with wide eyes, like a frightened fledgling fallen from its nest. A tired-faced detective with broad shoulders approached. His name was Miller. He asked the standard questions, his voice monotone, almost bored. Arthur answered mechanically, his mind still in shock, trying to piece together the nightmare of the day. When it was Leah's turn, the girl just repeated in a low, trembling voice what she had already told Arthur. She spoke of the nanny, the liquid, the fire, the locked door. Detective Miller jotted it all down in a small notepad, his expression impassive. "A nanny named Claire, you say?" he asked, skeptical. "We ran the name. There's no one by that name and description in the agency database you gave us. The documents she provided for the job, they were fake. The address she gave was for an abandoned building. It's like she never existed." The detective's words fell on Arthur like stones. A ghost. He had put his son's life in the hands of a ghost. Guilt gnawed at him, bitter as bile. How could he have been so blind, so negligent? And the girl, Miller continued, looking at Leah with thinly veiled suspicion. "She says she saw all this from the street. That's quite a story for a kid. It's the truth." Arthur's voice came out louder and harsher than he intended. He clutched Leo tighter. "She saved my son's life. If it weren't for her, he couldn't finish the sentence. His throat closed up. The detective just shrugged. "We'll do our job, sir. The initial forensics suggest the fire started from a short circuit in the old kitchen wiring. Could have been an accident or a robbery gone wrong. The kid might have gotten scared and made up the rest. An accident. A robbery, the easy explanation, the comfortable truth the police wanted to believe." Arthur felt the same helpless fury that had consumed him in his office. They weren't listening. They didn't want to see the dark truth hiding behind the smoke. As the firefighters finally brought the last of the flames under control, turning his home into a blackened, smoldering shell, Arthur's phone rang. It was Isabella. Her voice was a mix of panic and concern. "Arthur, honey, I saw it on the news. Oh my God, are you okay?" "Leo, we're fine," he answered, his voice hollow. "The house, it's gone. That doesn't matter. Things can be rebuilt. The important thing is that you're safe. I'm on my way right now." She hung up before he could say anything else. But something in her tone, a note of almost rehearsed relief, set off an alarm in his head. And then, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Where was Isabella when it all happened? She had left at noon. The fire started shortly after 2. And Claire, the ghost nanny, who had recommended her to him months ago with such enthusiasm. It had been Isabella. Night fell on the smoking ruins of the mansion, but for Arthur, the darkness was internal. He, Leo, and Leah were taken to a luxury hotel, an impersonal refuge of beige walls and generic furniture that only highlighted the loss of his home. Leo, exhausted by the ordeal, fell asleep almost instantly in a bed far too big for him, but his sleep was restless, punctuated by small whimpers and twitches. Arthur sat in the armchair by the bed, watching his son breathe, feeling like a useless guardian, a king deposed from his ruined castle. The suspicion about Isabella was a thorn in his mind, poisoning the memories of her smiles and affectionate gestures. Had it all been a sham, an elaborate performance with a terrifying purpose? The idea was so monstrous that part of him refused to accept it. Leah was sitting on the sofa across the room, huddled under a blanket, looking even smaller and more fragile in the lavish surroundings. She hadn't touched the room service Arthur had ordered, just held a mug of hot chocolate in her hands, as if its warmth comforted her. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words. He was the adult, the protector, but tonight the roles felt reversed. This small child, a stranger from the street, had become the guardian of his family. "You should eat something," he said softly, his voice hoarse. Leah shook her head. "I'm not hungry." Her eyes, however, were fixed on Leo's sleeping face. There was a concern in them, a tenderness that went beyond mere curiosity. "Why did you do it?" "Leah?" he asked, the question that had been haunting him since he saw her emerge from the smoke. "Why did you risk your life for him?" She shrugged, looking away. "I don't know. I used to watch him through the window. He always looked so happy, and so little." She paused, her lips trembling slightly. Nobody should be alone when there's danger. The simplicity of her answer disarmed him. There was no calculated heroism, no quest for reward. Just a pure impulse to protect an innocent, an impulse that he, with all his wealth and power, had almost failed to have. In that moment, the barrier between the millionaire and the street kid dissolved, and he saw only two people bound by their concern for the same child. The hotel room door opened, and Isabella swept in, her face a mask of distress. She rushed to Arthur, hugging him tightly. "My love, what a nightmare! I came as soon as I could." She then noticed Leah on the sofa, and her expression shifted for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something that wasn't surprise, but maybe recognition. It passed through her eyes before being replaced by calculated confusion. What is this girl doing here?" she asked, her voice hardening. "She saved Leo." "Isabella," Arthur said, watching her closely. Isabella looked from Leah to Arthur, her mouth forming a perfectly staged O of astonishment. "This girl, the beggar, Arthur, that's absurd. The police said it was an accident." "The police could be wrong," he replied, his voice cold as steel. At that moment, Arthur's phone rang again. It was Detective Miller. "Mr. Arthur, I have some bad news. A representative from Child Protective Services is on their way. Given the circumstances, a fire, lack of supervision, the presence of an unaccompanied minor, they need to assess your son's safety situation. There's a chance they might place him in temporary custody." Arthur's world stopped spinning. The words hit him with the force of a punch. Losing his son. After everything, after the fire, after the miraculous rescue, he could lose Leo. Not to the flames, but to bureaucracy, to a system that now saw him as an unfit, negligent father. It was his worst nightmare coming true. The soft knock on the hotel room door sounded like a hammer blow to Arthur's chest. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to not open it, to barricade himself inside with Leo and Leah and ignore the world outside. But he knew escape was impossible. The threat now wasn't fire, but pens and forms, a cold, impersonal system that could rip his heart out with the same efficiency as the flames. He glanced at Isabella, whose face wore a look of concern that now seemed hollow, theatrical. Then he looked at Leah, who had shrunk even further into the sofa, as if trying to become invisible. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he went to the door. The woman on the other side was middle-aged, with an impeccable grey pantsuit and a tight bun that allowed not a single hair to escape. Her eyes, behind thin-rimmed glasses, were sharp and devoid of emotion. She introduced herself as Ms. Evans. "Heard from Child Protective Services. May I come in, Mr. Arthur?" Her voice was polite, but it wasn't a request. It was a command. He stepped aside, his heart sinking with every inch she advanced into the room. Mrs. Evans surveyed the scene with a clinical gaze, her eyes passing over the sleeping Leo, over Isabella, and lingering on Leah with an expression of restrained disapproval. "The police briefed me on today's events," she began, sitting in a chair without being invited. "I'm here to assess the immediate environment and safety of the minor, Leonardo. He's perfectly safe with me," Arthur said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. His home was destroyed in a fire while he was under the care of a nanny who, apparently, doesn't exist, Ms. Evans countered, consulting her notes, and the only person present at the time of the rescue, besides the child, was— She raised her eyes to Leah. "This girl, a street child, with no established kinship or guardianship. You understand how this situation looks from our point of view, don't you?" "That girl is a hero," Arthur interjected, his voice rising an octave. "She saved my son." "Honey, calm down," Isabella said, placing a hand on his arm. She turned to the social worker with a conciliatory smile. "He's under terrible stress, as you can imagine. What he means to say is that we are all immensely grateful. But the girl's presence here is temporary, just until we understand what happened." Leah heard Isabella's words and felt a cold knot in her stomach. Her tone was sweet, but the meaning was bitter. "You don't belong here." Ms. Evans ignored Isabella and kept her eyes fixed on Arthur. "Your gratitude is understandable. My concern is stability, a safe and predictable environment for Leonardo. And right now, what I see is a father in a state of shock, a girlfriend, and an unknown child. This is not a stable environment." The air grew heavy. The implied threat hung over them all. Arthur took a deep breath, forcing himself to be calm. "What do you suggest?" Ms. Evans stared at him for a long moment, the decision forming in her eyes. "Given the exceptional circumstances, I will not remove the child tonight, provided certain conditions are met." A drop of relief trickled through Arthur, but it was immediately frozen by the woman's next words. "First, you and your son will be under probationary supervision for 90 days. Second, I want a full psychological report on both you and the child within 2 weeks." She paused, delivering the final blow. "And third, and this condition is non-negotiable, the girl cannot, under any circumstances, remain with you. She represents an element of instability and risk. She must be handed over to a state-run shelter." Immediately, Miss Evans's sentence hung in the air, cold and irrevocable. "Give up, Leah." To Arthur, the demand was more than cruel. It was a desecration. It was like thanking an angel for saving your life and then ripping off its wings. He looked at Leah, who was staring at him with wide eyes, a mixture of fear and resignation that broke his heart. In those eyes, he saw the reflection of his own powerlessness. He, the man who had built an empire, who could move markets with a decision, was cornered, forced to choose between the two people who most needed his protection. To keep Leah meant risking losing Leo. To give her up meant betraying the very soul of his humanity. "That is unacceptable," Arthur said, his voice low and tense, each word a struggle. "It's the only option on the table, sir," the social worker replied, unyielding. Isabella, seeing the storm gathering in Arthur's eyes, intervened quickly, her tone full of calculated reason. "Honey, she's right. Think of Leo. It's what's best for him. The girl will be fine. The shelters are equipped for this. We can't take any risks, not now." Her words were logical, reasonable. They were the words anyone would say, but to Arthur they sounded like the deepest of betrayals. She was willing to sacrifice his son's savior with unnerving ease. As the argument unfolded, Leah's mind was racing, as it always did when danger was near. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the looks, the tone of voice. She was the problem. Her presence was putting little Leo at risk. A shelter. She knew what a shelter was. It was a place with grey walls, harsh rules, and a loneliness shared with dozens of other sad faces. It was the place she always ran from. But the thought of Leo being torn from his father's arms was 1,000 times worse than any shelter. With a decision that seemed to age her decades in a single second, Leah stood up from the sofa, the blanket pooled at her feet, unnoticed. "I'll go," she said, her voice small but firm. Everyone turned to her, stunned. Arthur knelt in front of her. "No, Leah, you're not going anywhere. I'll figure something out." But Leah shook her head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She's right. If I stay, they'll take Leo, and he needs his dad." She looked at the sleeping boy, a protective, sacrificial love in her gaze. Then she turned to Isabella and, for the first time, spoke directly to her. "I remember you," she said, her voice suddenly clear and precise. "On the phone, in the garden, you were angry. You said, we have to accelerate the plans. You said, eliminate obstacles and secure the inheritance." The silence that followed was absolute, thick as concrete. Isabella went pale, her eyes widening in genuine panic. Miss Evans frowned, intrigued. Arthur froze, the blood turning to ice in his veins. An eidetic memory, the ability to recall details with photographic precision, a survival mechanism honed on the streets. "What is this girl talking about?" Isabella stammered, trying to force a laugh. "She's making things up." But the precision of the words that resonated with the suspicious talks of assets and the future, struck Arthur like a bolt of lightning. Inheritance, obstacles. The plan wasn't just about money. The fire wasn't meant to scare. The target wasn't just the house. The obstacle to be eliminated was Leo, and maybe himself. In that sterile hotel room, the monstrous truth finally revealed itself, more terrible and devastating than any flame. The silence in the hotel room was a vacuum, sucking out all the air and sound. Leah's words, precise and incriminating, hung in the center of the room like a poisonous cloud. Isabella, for an instant, looked like a wax statue. The blood drained from her face, her eyes fixed on the girl with an expression of pure terror. It was only a second, but for Arthur, it was enough. It was the confirmation his shattered heart needed. Isabella's mask had cracked, and behind it he glimpsed a bottomless darkness. Then came the denial, rushed and shrill. "This is absurd. It's insane," Isabella said, forcing a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She turned to Ms. Evans, appealing to authority, to logic. "Are you going to believe a delusional street kid? A child who's probably trying to take advantage of the situation to get a home? Arthur, for God's sake." She turned to him, her eyes pleading. "You've been fooled before. Don't you see it's the same thing? She's manipulating you, using your kindness against you." The words were the right ones, calculated to strike his deepest wound, but this time they didn't work, because between him and the accusation stood the indelible image of Leah running out of a burning house with his son in her arms. That act of pure courage was a truth more solid than any lie. Arthur stood up slowly, subtly placing himself between Isabella and the bed where Leo slept. It was an instinctive gesture, a father protecting his young. "Who recommended Claire to you, Isabella?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. I already told you. A friend of a friend. I wanted to help you. And the cameras that conveniently went offline? And your sudden interest in my assets, in securing the inheritance?" Each question was a shovelful of dirt on the coffin of her lies. "You're twisting everything. You're paranoid," she screamed, desperation beginning to eat away at her composure. "No," Arthur said, and in his voice was the certainty of a man who finally saw the truth, however ugly it was. "I was blind. But this little girl," he looked at Leah with a gratitude that choked him. "She made me see." Miss Evans watched the scene, her face impassive, but her eyes darted between Arthur and Isabella. She was no longer a bureaucrat assessing a case. She was a witness to human drama unfolding in its rawest form. Seeing that she had lost Arthur, Isabella panicked. She grabbed her purse and the phone from the table. "I'm not going to stand here and be insulted. This is madness. I'm leaving." She moved toward the door, but Arthur was faster. blocking her path. "You're not going anywhere." At that exact instant, as if by fate, Arthur's phone, which was on the bed, buzzed. The screen lit up with a message preview. It was from Detective Miller. Arthur picked up the device, his eyes locked on Isabella. He read the message aloud, each word dropping into the silent room like a hammer blow. "Mr. Arthur, we found the nanny. Her name isn't Claire. She confessed everything, said she was hired by your girlfriend Isabella to facilitate the accident. Payment was made from an offshore account in her name. We're on our way with a warrant." The text on the phone screen hung in the air, every letter a sentence of condemnation. Isabella's composure didn't just crack, it disintegrated, exploding into 1,000 pieces. The sophisticated, controlled woman vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. Her eyes flashed with hatred, not at Arthur, but at the small figure of Leah, the unlikely piece that had toppled her entire chessboard. "You!" Isabella hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the girl. "You little street rat! You ruined everything, everything!" The venom in her voice made Leah take a step back, but Arthur moved, placing himself firmly in front of her, a human shield. "It's over, Isabella," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion but a glacial exhaustion. At that moment, firm knocks sounded at the door, not the soft rap of Miss Evans, but the heavy sound of authority. Arthur opened it. Detective Miller stood there, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. His tired eyes went to Isabella, whose furious expression had morphed into mute panic, and then settled on Arthur. "We have a full confession," Miller said, his voice grave. "The plan was to make it look like a tragic accident, eliminating the primary heir. With you weakened by the loss, she would become your savior, your support, and rush you into a marriage, securing total control of the fortune. The nanny was just a disposable pawn." Every word confirmed the monstrosity Leah had uncovered. Isabella said nothing more. Her silence was her final confession. As the officers read her rights and led her from the room, she didn't look at Arthur. Her last glare, filled with a burning resentment, was for the little girl huddled behind him. When the door closed, a deep, heavy silence settled over the room. It was over. The monster had been exposed and taken away. But the threat from Miss Evans still lingered. She stood, adjusting her pantsuit, her expression unreadable. Arthur braced himself for a fight, to plead, to battle for custody of his son and for Leah's safety. But the social worker surprised him. She looked at little Leo, who was beginning to stir in the bed, and then at Leah, who was still trembling slightly. "The law is made of rules, Mr. Arthur," she began, her voice softer than before. "But sometimes life shows us that the rules don't cover everything. My job is to ensure a child's safety, and tonight," she paused, her eyes meeting Arthur's, "I saw the person who truly ensured your son's safety." She walked over to the hotel phone. "I'm going to file a report. I will state that Leonardo is in the care of a devoted and protective father, and that he has a very brave guardian." She looked directly at Leah. "I think the probationary supervision can be re-evaluated. And as for the girl," she sighed, "the law requires a procedure, but what I see here, against all odds, is the beginning of a family, and my job isn't to break families apart." The relief that flooded Arthur was so powerful it made him dizzy. The tears came without warning, silent and hot. He knelt in front of Leah, taking her small hands in his. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not going to any shelter. Ever?" Leah looked up at him, her big eyes searching his face for the truth, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but it lit up the entire room. She threw herself into his arms, hugging his neck with all the strength her little arms could muster. Her yes was a happy sob against his shoulder. In the midst of the ashes of one life and the promise of another, he knew the most important job of his life was just beginning. To build a home, a real one. 4 weeks had passed. 4 weeks that felt like a lifetime. The smell of smoke had been replaced by the smell of fresh paint in a spacious rented apartment, with windows that opened onto a green park. The mansion, a blackened shell, was a distant memory, a monument to a life that no longer existed. And Arthur, for the first time in years, felt grateful for it. That fire, born of malice, had purified his life in a way he never imagined possible. It had burned down the walls of his mistrust, reduced his insecurities to ash, and from the ruins, allowed something new and infinitely more valuable to grow. Sitting at the dining room table, he watched the scene that had become his new, precious routine. Leo, now almost 3, was stacking colorful blocks on the rug, letting out peals of laughter each time his wobbly tower collapsed. Beside him, Leah lay on her stomach, concentrating on a drawing. She no longer wore the tattered, oversized clothes. She was in denim overalls and a yellow shirt, and her hair, once matted, was now clean and held back in a neat braid. She was no longer the silent, frightened girl from the gate. There was laughter in her eyes and a lightness to her movements that only safety and affection can provide. Arthur stood and walked over to her, looking over her shoulder. On the paper, in hesitant but loving strokes, was a drawing of 3 figures holding hands, one big, one small, and one a little bigger. Above them, a smiling sun and a house with smoke coming from the chimney, a happy, white wisp of smoke. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick. Leah looked up, a shy smile on her lips. "It's us." He knelt beside her, his heart overflowing with an emotion so intense it almost hurt. "Leah, I need to ask you something very important." She put down her colored pencil, her full attention on him. "You saved my life, and Leo's. You gave us a future, and I can't imagine a future without you in it anymore, not as a visitor or as someone I'm just helping." He took a deep breath, the words coming out with the force of a long-held truth. "I would like to be your father. I'd like you to be my daughter, Leah. Officially, if you'll have me." Of course, the tears Leah had been holding back since that night in the hotel finally fell, but they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were of relief, of belonging. She didn't say anything. She just launched herself into his arms, hugging his neck with all the strength she had. Her yes was a happy sob against his shoulder. The following week, Arthur's lawyers began 2 processes. One was the adoption of Leah, giving her a last name and a forever home. The other was the creation of the Guardian Angel Foundation, an institution with the sole purpose of helping homeless children, ensuring no other Leah would have to fight for survival alone. Arthur decided he would rebuild the house on the same lot, but it would no longer be a fortress. It would be a home with open gates and a spare bedroom, painted in his new daughter's favorite color. That evening, the 3 of them sat on the sofa, looking at Leah's drawing, now framed and hanging on the wall. Leo fell asleep between them, his head in Leah's lap. Arthur put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, feeling the comforting weight of her presence. He finally understood. True wealth wasn't locked in safes or reflected on financial spreadsheets. It was right here, in this quiet embrace, in the steady breathing of his children. His greatest weakness, his compassion, had become his greatest strength, proving that sometimes angels come in the most unexpected forms.